Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. That's the secular dream, isn't it? A world free from war and greed and existential dread. A world of people living in the moment, following their whims and desires. A world, importantly, free from heaven and hell. A world, crucially, free from God himself. And in this mindset, religion is a backward thing, a source of division, violence, bigotry. If we can move towards a secular humanist society based on reason and rationality, on science, and an ethical framework created around individuality, autonomy, equality, then surely the world would be a better place. Secularism, more formally, can be expressed as in the Collins Concise Dictionary. It's the rejection of religion in favor of the advancement of humanity by its own efforts. And this is what our society has done, is it not? Religious symbolism and imagery have lost their place in our nation. References to God are slim on the ground. And the majority of the time faith is mentioned, it is largely within a negative frame of reference. By and large, our societies decide that religion simply isn't worth celebrating. In fact, the census of 2021 found that for the first time in its history, less than half of respondents identified as Christians. The second largest group of that was no religion. And this is even more pronounced when you look at the younger age groups. A Guardian article reported that more than 50% of under 40s identify as non-religious. And when we do celebrate Christianity, it's a hollowed out version of itself, isn't it? Easter and Christianity are mere shadows of what they once were. They're opportunities for selling chocolate and spinning a profit. And if there are any allusions to their once Christian foundations, it's as myth, where ideas of joy and peace and hope are shorn from their roots. Secularism is the flavor of the month. And there is something deeply ironic about all this, because secularism began in classical Christian thought. Theologian Theo Hobson argues that secular initially simply meant the present age, that is, the time before Jesus came again. Jonathan Chaplin similarly noted that it was a theological idea, whereas now it has overwhelmingly come to refer to just a spatially defined zone of human conduct in which God and religion are absent, or at their very best, or at least they are irrelevant. To put it another way, academic David Koyzis argues that the contemporary secularism or humanism rests on a predominant belief in human autonomy, according to which human beings determine the course of their own life without reference to God's will. And it's in this sense of the world that is of interest, for this is a massive experiment, almost unprecedented in history or in contemporary society. Societies historically have believed in a God or some sort of higher power or force, and this remains largely true today, with many non-Western countries either still formally committed to a faith, such as Islam, or experiencing massive religious growth, such as the rise of Christianity in parts of China and Africa. Carl Trueman explains this experiment as follows. He says, gradually as a society, we have shifted from a worldview which grounds meaning and value in something higher than ourselves, be that a God or a concept like fate, into a world where truth and meaning reside solely in us. This process can be traced from Rousseau declaring society as an oppressive force that corrupted and subjugated the individuals, as shackles to be thrown off, in other words. Marx continued this line of thinking, targeting the existing hierarchies, such as the church and religion more broadly, saying they're oppressive tools. Perhaps the most devastating shift came with Darwin's evolutionary biology, which removed the need for divine design and therefore human nature was kind of changed. All this paves the way for the death of God, the conclusion that Nietzsche landed on years before anyone else, and the promotion of our feelings and whims as the ultimate basis for moral reality. Paul Kingsnorth, the author, refers to Alistair MacIntyre's explanation, saying that the Enlightenment project of the 18th century was an attempt to build a morality loosed from theology. He says this is a catastrophic failure. He says if the correct path for society or the individual was based on nothing more than an individual's personal judgment, then who or what is to be the final arbiter? Ultimately, without that higher purpose to bind it, society would fall, as it has, into emotivism, relativism, and ultimately disintegration. And the question is, can a society function like this? And I think if we're honest, the answer is no. Turning in on ourselves as a substitute for religion is totally unworkable. It offers no overarching moral story beyond our own individual self-expression and sense of fulfillment. It offers no God, no arbiter of justice, no ultimate meaning, no ultimate purpose or telos. There is nothing inherently right and nothing inherently wrong. We're stuck in a sludge of moral relativism with our only opt-outs, a vaguely defined belief in consent and the harm principle. It gives no guiding principles to shape our actions or strengthen our communities. It provides nothing beyond whose emotions carry more weight and whose voice can shout louder. Priest Giles Fraser puts it like this: without a meaningful moral story to underpin it, might will be right and power supreme. But you might contend that we have a moral story. We believe in progress and equality, in dignity, freedom, and tolerance. And you'd be right to some extent. These values dominate our discourse and guide our view of the world. But to claim these values is not actually to claim a secular outlook on life, but rather to claim something that is distinctly Christian. For where do all these values stem? It's not at all clear that they can be found in pure rationality and the scientific method. Rebecca McLaughlin argues that if there is no God who created us in his image, then human equality is a myth. She goes on to quote the atheist Yuval Noah Harari, who argues that human beings have no natural rights, just as spiders, hyenas, and chimpanzees have no natural rights. Historian Tom Holland goes even further. He says there is no single text, perhaps, that is more consistently the object of humanist contempt than the book of Genesis. And yet humanists, no less than Jews or Christians, are indelibly stamped by it. In fact, if there is a single wellspring for the reverence they display towards their own species, it is the opening chapter of the Bible. To strip away the God that underpins all these moral values is, as one author puts it, to have the fruit without the root. It is to saw off the very branch on which we sit. Holland agrees again. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. To get rid of God is to get rid of our concepts of beauty and the value and the dignity of humanity. Because without another origin story, all that we have is that humans are mere accidents, just clumps of cells, nothing more than just another animal. And the question is, doesn't this lead us into deeply concerning moral territory? Territory in which humans can be viewed as resources to be extracted, tools to be used, organs to be harvested. Territory in which humans, just like animals, can become a nuisance and so can be purged. Territory in which humans are based on their value and the contribution of their intelligence or their abilities. Do we not see the danger here? And if we think these things are a long way off, then I'm sorry, but we've missed what's going on around us. Social media algorithms see humans not as people to serve, but as resources to be extracted for profit through advertising, through data, and through an increasing push towards extreme opinions and lifestyles that gain clicks. Take a look at the sexualized society we live in, where pornography treats people as mere objects to be used and abused at leisure. Women, men, even children in this framework are simply as valuable as their sexual availability and has fueled a huge human trafficking business. Consider calls from some sections of the environmentalist movement to commit genocide against humans for the good of the planet. Or perhaps consider the fact that abortion laws in the UK have a 24-week limit. But if the baby has disabilities, including Down syndrome, then can be aborted at any point during the pregnancy. To build a moral framework on ourselves is to build a moral framework that serves the powerful and exploits the weak. And we've been here before. In humanist thinking, ancient Rome and Greece have a positive place. They're the origins of rationality, of democracy, of science. And yet a quick look at those societies reveals a society in which tyranny reigns supreme. Sharon James notes that of the 70 or so million people in the Roman Empire, at any one time, around a seventh of them, that is 10 million, might have been slaves. Tom Holland argues that in Rome, men no more hesitated to use slaves and prostitutes to relieve themselves of their sexual needs than they did to use the side of the road as a toilet. Commentator Ed West explains that a Roman father had total power of life and death over his children, and female infanticide was not unusual. Romans would happily watch an innocent man being torn to pieces by a wild animal for entertainment. Slavery was ubiquitous, and it was assumed that a man would sexually abuse his female slave. Charitable giving outside the family was rare, and those who reached rock bottom in the imperial city would be left literally to die in the gutter. It was Christianity with its message that every human was made in the image of God, that every individual had value and dignity and was worthy of love, respect, and compassion that changed this, not Enlightenment values. Enlightenment values with a focus on individualism, on rationality, and on science simply cannot compete with the moral revolution that Christianity set about. Whereas the ancient world saw the poor and the marginalized as tools to be used or ignored, Christianity spoke of the poor as needy and blessed. Whereas the kings and queens of the ancient world developed their wealth and comfort through slave labor, the king presented by Christianity washed the feet of his disciples, hung out with the deplorables of his day, and died the death of a thief on a Roman cross. The Christian God was not one of domineering exploitation, but a humble servant who was tried in a kangaroo court, found guilty of trumped-up charges, flogged, mocked, and crucified. If the ancient world celebrated power, the Christian faith celebrated meekness. The world was remade. Christians were foundational in developing healthcare, education, poverty relief programs, and in a world known for its sexual abuses, encouraging sexual restraint and the individual liberty of each and every person. Far from having lower standards for justice than we do, Christianity had and continues to have far higher. In fact, Christianity offers the most compelling moral vision. Let's begin by looking at the Christian God. Psalm 9, for example, tells us that the Lord is known by his acts of justice, that he rebukes the nations and destroys the wicked, that he is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble, that he who avenges blood remembers. He does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. God will never forget the needy. The hope of the afflicted will never perish. The Christian God is one of justice, and this can be seen not only in his character, but also in the way that he calls his people to live. Jesus summarizes the whole Old Testament law like this: the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And this isn't just the mere vacuous chat or virtue signaling that we might be used to today. Time and time again, God rebukes his people for their failure to act justly. He tells them to reform their ways and their actions, and he will let them live in this place. Do not just trust in deceptive words. If you really know, if you really change your ways, your actions, and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. God rebukes them. And what's more, not only does God demand justice, he promises to deliver justice. He promises a world in which there is no more mourning or crying or pain, one in which the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and where justice will be given to the poor of the earth, and where the wicked will be slain. And yet Christianity also explains the injustice in our society. Far from being a distant reality that is outdated and irrelevant today, the Bible reflects the realities of the world we live in. For it gives us countless evidence of broken systems and broken people, and ultimately lays the blame for injustice at our door. For whilst humans have great capacity for good, we too have great capacity for evil. Solzhenitsyn once said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states or between classes, nor even political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." Injustice, then, is a problem that can't be solved by secularism. It can't be solved by building a morality on ourselves, because it is a problem entirely of our own doing. Each one of us has failed to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. In fact, it's part of the human condition. The Bible says, if you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? And yet Jesus has good news for us. You see, we tried to build a better world by rejecting God and by our own sheer hard work, but to reject God is to reject the source of all goodness, life, and liberty. To reject God is to saw our morals off from the tree that sustains them. And this is what humans have tried to do from the beginning, to create a world without the good God that made it. If it wasn't secularism, it was another God of some kind, another religion. And each time we found ourselves in a whole heap of problems. And it is these problems that Jesus came to solve. For he came not to provide a mere example to us that if only we try harder, we can continue to do our own thing and find justice on our own terms. No, Jesus came to show us the folly of such living. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, they were obsessed with human effort. In fact, they were so focused on their own hard work that they forgot about the God all the work was meant to serve. Instead, their confidence was in themselves. They thought rules and moral purity would be enough, and yet Jesus exposes their foolishness. He says to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." You see, Jesus didn't come to puff up those who think they're moral people. Because as we've seen, if we ask God to judge us on our own efforts, then who can stand? No, Jesus came to save those who know they've erred and strayed. Those who know they've turned from God and sought life on their own terms. And to do that, he had to die. For the result of rejecting God, the source of all life and goodness and justice, well, it's death. The great secular experiment is not one that brings life and liberty and justice, but brings death and decay. Death and decay as morality crumbles around us. Death and decay as we reap the fruits of our own efforts. Death and decay as ultimately we have to stand before the Creator and Lord of all and explain why we rejected him. But Jesus offers us life. He offers us liberty. He offers us justice. You see, Jesus' death wasn't some great accident, some tragic end to a moral great teacher. Jesus' death, no, was God's declaration to the world that you can't do this without me. Jesus' death was God's divine act of justice, judging the world for its rebellion. Jesus' death was God's medicine to heal the sick and offer of life to any who know that they need it.